So there are a lot of passages in the Bible that seem to be contradictory, and people who want to not believe in God or not believe in the authenticity or the accuracy or the inerrancy of the scriptures will often point out these contradictions and then use them as a reason to not believe in the Bible or the truth or the veracity of the stories that we see there. One of these contradictions has to do with the Last Supper. Was the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples in the upper room that we read about in the Gospel of John, and Matthew, and Mark, and Luke, was this actually a for reals Passover? And if it was, how could Jesus also die on Passover? So a lot of people think, well, it can only be one day or the other. You can't have Jesus celebrating the Passover and then also dying on Passover. So I've done a video, and I will leave a link to it if I remember to do that, where I talked about how Jesus' crucifixion was on a Wednesday. It had to be on a Wednesday. There was no other day that would make an allowance for Jesus to be in the grave 3 days and 3 nights, 3 full days and 3 nights. And in another Bible study video that I did, I also sought to answer the question, did Jesus die on the correct Passover? And how do we know that? How do we know which Passover is the correct Passover? And there's so many ideas out there about which is the correct calendar and so on and so forth. So I showed how Jesus did die on the correct Passover, which may not have been the Passover as was originally intended by God, but it was the Passover that he honored. So in this video today, we're going to go over a couple of ways that we can know that the Last Supper was a Passover meal and that Jesus also did die on Passover. But before we talk about the Passover, how it was celebrated in the first century, I want to talk about Good Friday, and I want to talk about Easter Sunday. And most of the Christian world actually observes the crucifixion of Christ as being on a Friday. And it's what we in the West would call Good Friday. Now, it's not called that all over the world, but the Western Church calls that Good Friday. And we celebrate the resurrection of Christ on Resurrection Day or Easter Sunday. Many Christians are aware of the pagan traditions that have infiltrated our celebration of the resurrection of Christ, including, dyeing eggs and the bunny rabbits, and even the name Astarte is the name of a goddess that was sort of brought in and incorporated into so-called Christian celebrations. So we have paganism and Christianity and Judaism all sort of mixed together in this one kind of soup. And Satan sure has done his best to muddy the waters when it came to Christ's death and his resurrection. And it wasn't just with Catholicism, which we'll talk about here in a minute, introducing some of this pagan stuff. Satan was muddying the waters long before, in the first century, even before the first century, before Jesus was born. He was muddying the waters of Judaism, so that when we actually go to read the descriptions of Christ's death and Passover and all of that, we run into these what seem like insurmountable contradictions. So the questions are raised, how could Jesus die on a Friday, rise on a Sunday, and still be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth? Okay, and that's Matthew 16:40. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And then how could Jesus both observe the Passover with his disciples at the Last Supper and also die on Passover? Doesn't that seem contradictory? How could that happen? And the third question is, how is it that there's no record really of a Passover lamb being eaten at the Last Supper? But here's the thing, even though Satan has done his best to keep us from understanding the truth in the Word of God and just muddying the waters in all kinds of ways so that we don't really understand how Jesus perfectly fulfilled the Passover prophecies, God has seen fit to allow those of us who are living here at the end of the age to unravel some of these mysteries. And I just want to thank God for the many tireless researchers and the archaeologists and the dedicated believers whose life's work has actually contributed to the unraveling and the resolving of seeming contradictions in the biblical record, especially as it pertains to the events surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection. So in this Bible study, I'm actually going to be quoting from several people whose research I found to be very valuable, and I'm going to be adding this to my personal understanding of the Passover as it may have been experienced in the first century. So I'm going to read an article from a website called truthinscripture.net, and this is talking about basically the tradition of Good Friday. Okay, so historically, the Christian church has held to a tradition that the death and burial of Jesus was on Good Friday of the week of crucifixion, and that the resurrection was on a Sunday morning before the women mentioned in the gospel accounts arrived at the tomb. But is this tradition true? It should be noted that Good Friday was not celebrated in the early church. For the first 200 to 300 years, the early church celebrated the death, burial, and resurrection events within the framework of the feasts of the Lord, Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits, as the church was still very Jewish, and Jesus was regarded as the true Passover lamb. And we see evidence of that in 1 Corinthians 5:7, Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us. This early church celebration included 2 days of fasting prior to the celebration of the resurrection and was not anchored on a particular day of the week, since the Jewish Passover could float to various days of the week depending on the lunar Jewish calendar. So how did the first and second day of fasting eventually evolve into a distinct day of celebration known as Good Friday? And celebration really should be in quotes there. The history leads us once again to the Roman Catholic Church. According to a sermon, okay, and this guy that I'm quoting is now quoting somebody else, by David L. Brown, and the name of the sermon was Good Friday was not celebrated in the early church. Did Jesus die on Good Friday or Wednesday? Good Friday evolved after AD 325 as one of the results of Constantine's Council of Nicaea. At the time, the council issued the Easter Rule, marking Easter as the day of the resurrection to be celebrated on Sunday, but it did not specify the exact Sunday. The Bishop of Alexandria was authorized to determine the exact Sunday. Later in the 7th century, the church ruled that Easter was to be the first Sunday that occurred after the first full moon on or after the vernal equinox. I know that's kind of a mouthful. Easter is therefore celebrated on a Sunday between the dates of March 22nd and April 25th. Good Friday remained a separate observance. Historians can trace the development of Good Friday as the day of Jesus' death to the Roman Catholic festivals held in Jerusalem in the 4th century. It is essentially an invention of the Roman Catholic Church, derived from a misunderstanding of which Sabbath the Apostle Mark was referring to in Mark 15:42, where he wrote, "And now when the even was come, because it was the preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath." The Roman Church assumed this referred to the weekly Sabbath and failed to understand that it was the first day of the 7-day festival of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is also a Sabbath, a high holy day. According to David L. Brown, this first day of unleavened bread is the Sabbath following the crucifixion to which Mark is referring, and not the weekly Sabbath. Consequently, the Catholic Church misplaced the day of the crucifixion as Friday, which became Good Friday, rather than correctly allowing that the day of Jesus' death was a floating day on the Jewish calendar. Okay, and I'm leaving the links to the sources in my show notes here. So, was the Last Supper a Passover meal? So, if Jesus was the Passover lamb who was slain on Passover, then how could he have a Passover with his disciples the night before? There are actually two possible solutions to this seeming contradiction, though more may exist. I think the two that I'm going to present to you today are adequate to resolve this contradiction. The first option here is that Jesus may have observed the Essene Passover, which was not at a different time, and we're going to talk about that. And the second option here is that coexisting religious factions in the first century both observed Passover at different times. So in other words, there were religious factions, and we know they existed. We know the Pharisees and the Sadducees were not on the same page with regard to their ideas about theology and so on. And they actually had differing ways that they celebrated and observed Passover. So there were three main religious factions in Judea during the first century. Most of us are familiar with the Pharisees. They were the religious, the righteous, the biblical conservatives of their day. And the Sadducees were the religious, kind of the aristocracy, who controlled the priesthood and they controlled the temple. And then there were the Essenes that we don't know much about. They're not really spoken of in the scriptures, but they're hinted at. Let's put it that way. The Essenes are hinted at. And some people have talked about when we read in scriptures about devout men who came and did this, or devout people, they may have actually been Essene. And the Essenes were sort of an ascetic, pious group of Jews who actually had abandoned the whole priesthood, temple, sacrificial system due to its corruption. They just were out of there. And the idea that they held in their heart was, back in the day when God said about the sacrifices that the Jews were bringing to him, he said, I hate them. I hate your sacrifices. They're a stench. I really wish you wouldn't do that. I'm just sort of paraphrasing there. But the Essenes, in a way, took that seriously, and they said, you know what? If God's done with this, we're kind of done with it too. And there's also a fourth group that we do read about in the scriptures, and that's the Samaritans. They were considered half-breeds. They had their own temple, but they also observed Passover. So they would comprise probably a fourth faction, although that doesn't really play into what we're talking about today. So each of these religious factions had their own views about the timing of the feast. They had their own interpretation of what God was talking about in Exodus and Numbers. They had their own interpretation about the timing of the feast, the days, and how the ways in which these feasts were to be observed, and even the calendars that they used to calculate these things were not the same. So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, there was a lot of light shed on the religious group who made up this community in Qumran. Usually this group is referred to as the Essenes. The Essenes numbered about 4,000 people total, and in addition to living in the Dead Sea area, they lived in various communities throughout Judea, including an enclave in Jerusalem. And in 1988, archaeologists unearthed the Essene Gate in Jerusalem, which is near Mount Zion. So I have a link for that if you want to read about this archaeological dig. It's pretty cool. So we know that the Essenes had a presence in Jerusalem, that they were actually in what we would probably call the Essene quarter of the city of Jerusalem, in the area where Mount Zion is located. Now, contained within the Dead Sea Scrolls were a variety of writings, including copies of the Old Testament scriptures, commentaries, and the calendar that they used to calculate the beginning of months, the Sabbath days, and the feast days. And I'm leaving a link to a website where you can take a look at that. And the Essene calendar was actually a fairly simple, straightforward calendar. It was a solar calendar with 364 days. And it shouldn't be confused with the lunar solar calendar that was used by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And if you were an Essene, you would always observe Passover on the third day of the week, which by our reckoning, we would call it a Tuesday. Okay, so the calendar that was used by the Pharisees and the Sadducees followed the phases of the moon. Now, if someone uses a calendar that incorporates the phases of the moon, what it means is that the day of the week on which Passover falls could float from year to year. It wouldn't always be on a Tuesday, for example. Unlike the Essenes who observe Passover on Tuesday, it could be any day of the week. And that's sort of how it is now. Passover can be on any day of the week. So in a previous Bible study, I discussed how biblical and astronomical evidence points to Jesus' crucifixion taking place on a Wednesday, the fourth day of the week in 31 AD. Okay, with Jesus rising from the dead at the close of the Sabbath, 3 days and 3 nights later. Now, some scholars believe that Jesus celebrated the Passover according to the Essene tradition, following the date for Passover on their calendar. So if Jesus was crucified on Wednesday, he would have hosted an Essene Passover the day before, on Tuesday. So the following excerpt that I'm going to be quoting is taken from a blog post that was written by a Dr. Larry Selig, and he's actually written a book called Uncovering Little Known Stories of Holy Week. So this is a quote from him, and this is what he says, okay? We know it was an Essene Passover that Jesus celebrated with his disciples because, and he's going to give 2 main reasons for this. First, Jesus told his disciples preparing the feast to find the place where they were going to celebrate it by following a man with a jug of water on his head. We see this in Mark 14:13-16. Only in an Essene community did men carry water from the spring or well to their home. All other Jews relegated this task to women. And secondly, when the disciples arrived for the Passover, that is the Last Supper, they had already taken their required ritual baths. And just kind of as an aside here, the Essenes were very, very committed to being ritually pure. And they had mikvahs and all places for washings and all of that, even out in the desert, out in the Dead Sea area. Lots of mikvahs have been discovered. So they were big into this ritual washing and cleansing. So when the disciples arrived for the Passover, they had already taken their required ritual baths. But Essenes believed that walking to the feast would pick up additional dirt of unrighteousness on their feet. Thus, an additional foot washing was necessary. And when they forgot that requirement, Jesus volunteered to wash their feet. And Peter protested, and in John 13, verses 6-10 states this. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. And Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then, Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. And Jesus answered, those who have taken a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. And of course, we know that was Judas. And then it goes on to say, as was the Essene custom, no lamb was prepared for that Passover meal. So the Essenes did not engage in animal sacrifices of any kind, believing that the corruption of the temple system was so great as to be irrecoverable. To participate in the temple sacrifices meant that you were a partaker of the corrupt priestly system. So if Jesus observed the Essene practice of holding the Passover on Tuesday evening, then the Last Supper would have indeed been a Passover observance, complete with the foot washing ritual. The bread and the wine would be the main symbolic components of the feast. And as an aside, that was something the Essenes did. Jesus, no doubt, reframed the symbolism of the bread and wine, with the bread representing himself, the Lamb of God, whose body would soon hang on a cross and whose blood would be shed for the remission of sins. Okay, so that's the end of that quote. And Jesus and his disciples would observe the Essene Passover at sundown, and later that night they would cross the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, where Jesus would be betrayed and arrested. So that's the Essene Passover, which is always on a Tuesday. And remember, if you've watched that other video, Jesus was crucified on a Wednesday. According to the Julian calendar, according to the Naval Astronomical Observatory, and according to the prophecy in Daniel 9, and according to what we read about Jesus' anointing at his baptism, we can calculate Jesus was anointed in the fall on the Day of Atonement in AD 27, 483 years after the decree went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. That's when the Messiah, the Prince, was anointed, and then 3.5 years later he was crucified, which would be at Passover in AD 31. So the second Passover option here has to do with differences in how the Pharisees and Sadducees interpreted the phrase at twilight or between the evenings. And here's the passage in question, Leviticus 23:5. In the first month, that is Nisan, on the 14th day of the month, that is Nisan 14, at twilight, and some passages or some translations will say between the evenings, is the Lord's Passover. What about the original Passover that took place in Egypt? What commands did God give the Israelites through Moses at that time? And the reason why that's important is because that sort of set the pattern for how this was to play out every year, thereafter. So I'm going to now quote an excerpt from Joseph Leonard's book, Mysteries of Jesus' Life Revealed, His Birth, Death, Resurrection, and Ascensions. So when was the date on the Jewish calendar of the original Passover? This is clearly stated in Leviticus 23:5-7. In the first month, that is the month of Nisan, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight is the Lord's Passover. And this date is reiterated in Exodus 12:6 and again in Numbers 9:1-5 and 28 verse 16. It was essential for Jesus as the Messiah to die and resurrect on the exact days revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai. So why is this so important? It's important because there developed among factions within Judaism other dates for Passover, as well as other times during Nisan 14. Avi ben Mordecai explains that over the centuries, a reinterpretation of the meaning of the term at twilight in, for example, Exodus 12:6 came to mean at the end of the day of Nisan 14, as opposed to the beginning of Nisan 14, both being at twilight. And I'm going to show you what that looks like here in just a minute by what's on my board here. One faction would observe the killing of the Passover lamb at twilight in between the 13th and 14th of Nisan, and one would observe the killing of the lamb at twilight in between the 14th and 15th of Nisan. In both cases, it's still the 14th, but one is at the beginning of the Jewish day and one is at the end of the day. So what does that look like? Well, the way we Westerners, treat time, it's all very precise, to the minute, so on and so forth, and we run time through clocks. Through clocks, and we want everything to be exactly right. Now that's more so with Westerners and Europeans and Americans and so on than it is with other cultures which have a more relaxed attitude about time. And in fact, the Jewish people did have a concept of sort of a precise time, but mostly their time was actually connected to the sun and the moon. So they're watching the sun and the moon rather than watching a clock or looking at a calendar. So there'd be dawn, high noon, and then toward the end of the day, they would have what was called twilight, or between the evenings, and then it would be night, and then you go toward dawn and you'd have a new day, noon, again twilight, that is between the evenings, nighttime, dawn, day, and so on. So rather than being like a digital thing, it was very analog. According to Genesis 1, there's evening and there's morning the first day, evening and morning day 2. So in the Jewish mindset, the evening began the day. Okay, so you started the day the night before. It almost has to be run through a translator in order for Westerners, people who use the Gregorian calendar, to be able to get this in our heads. But if you have the 13th of Nisan here, okay, we'd be beginning to switch from the 13th to the 14th right here at twilight. And once the sun went down, then it would be officially the 14th. And then you'd have night and dawn, and then this whole day right here is the 14th. But it started back here at twilight, okay, between the evenings. And so this whole day right here would be Passover, right? And then there would be another twilight still on the 14th until the sun went down. It would be then the 15th, and then this whole day from twilight between the evenings until this between the evenings would be the 15th day, which was the first day of unleavened bread, okay, which is on the 15th of Nisan. So in the first century, if this was a Wednesday, okay, then this right here would be a Tuesday. And as you were moving from Tuesday night, crossing that line into the evening part, you would be moving into the 14th day and actually celebrating your Passover meal that night on the 14th. But, from our way of viewing it, it was the third day of the week, and a Wednesday Passover would be on the fourth day. Okay. And I realize all this gets a little confusing, but if you think about this as not, being a clock, and being very precise time, but as the sun coming up and then the sun going down, and as we're moving into the evening of another day, you can see how you can make this transition where you're killing the Passover lamb on the 13th, eating the Passover meal on the 14th. And then Jesus could still all through the night be tried, and the trials and so on and so forth, and then be hung on a cross right here, and then by 3 in the afternoon between the evenings he would die. Okay, so all that's still on the 14th. That is a second option. And by the way, Pharisees preferred this one, that you would have the Passover lamb slain here on the 13th. You would eat it then as you're going into the 14th, and this would be Passover then. And it would also be the preparation day for this Sabbath, which was right here. The first day of unleavened bread was a high Sabbath. So the Passover was also a preparation day. Okay, so this is where it all gets kind of confusing, because there's 2 Sabbaths actually during that week where we have Jesus dying and rising from the dead. You have the Sabbath, which is the first day of unleavened bread, which would then been on a Thursday, leaving us a Friday, which is another preparation day, going into the Sabbath day. So there are 2 Sabbaths. This one here, which would been on a Thursday, and the other Sabbath, which is the regular Saturday Sabbath. I'm using Gregorian language here, even though I know this is not exactly precise. I'm trying to help people understand this, okay? So Jesus would have resurrected from the dead at the end of the Sabbath, which would have been after sundown, okay? So in the first century, the Passover was not celebrated as a distinct feast. It was incorporated with unleavened bread. So they were like one feast, which if you sacrifice the lamb here, okay, on this 14th, then immediately you go into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then it's also Passover. So those 2 days are sort of combined in this one feast day. And that's how we read about it when we read about it in the scriptures. However, at the time of the original Exodus, Passover was actually a 24-hour day on the 14th, and the first day of unleavened bread was on the 15th. And this is pretty clear in the scriptures. And it was during this time, back in the book of Exodus, that the Passover lambs would be slain between the evenings here, 13 and 14. They would be eaten on the 14th. And, Passover, the death angel would come over during that night. And then the next day, that would be when they would get the spoils from their Egyptian neighbors. And then that following day was when they made their exit out of Egypt. That would have been on the day of unleavened bread. Okay, remember they didn't have time to leaven their bread. Reading the history of the Jews and, all the times they were taken over by different empires, and when the Greeks came in and tried to Hellenize the Jews, and you have the whole Maccabean revolt, and then you have the Hasmonean kingdom coming in, and there's a bunch of intrigue and all of that goes with them and with that dynasty, and then they die out, and now you've got the Idumeans, Herod, coming in as another dynasty, and siding with the Romans. By the time all of that transpired, the Sadducees were actually in control of the temple, and the Sadducees were like the elite. They were the aristocracy, and they were, basically in control of the temple and the sacrifices. They were in control of the calendar and the priesthood, and the observance of Passover and the first day of unleavened bread. For some reason, they combined into one feast. So we read about this in Mark 14:12. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when the Passover lamb was to be sacrificed, Jesus asked him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" So my understanding is that the Pharisees actually observed the Passover on the evening of the 13th going into the 14th, and the Essenes did that too. And that would have been how they did it in Moses' day as well. And the Sadducees observed the feast going from the 14th into the 15th day, which was when Christ was crucified. And because they were the stewards over the temple and the Passover and the calendars and all that system, even though it wasn't technically correct according to God's way of thinking about these things, God honored their stewardship of that. And I've talked about that in other videos. And he didn't remove that from them. And he actually prophesied through Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. I mean, God actually recognized Caiaphas as the high priest, even though he was exceedingly corrupt. So that's what they did. And they crucified Jesus on this day. And because they didn't want to defile themselves by going into, see Pilate and all of that, and they stood out there, so they wouldn't get defiled. That would have been right here on the 14th. Both the Pharisees and the Sadducees observe Passover on the 14th of Nisan, but at different ends of the day. Okay, so it's possible for Jesus to observe the Passover, whether he was using the Mosaic Passover, which would have been the 13th going into the 14th, that between the evenings, that twilight, whether he was doing it according to the Mosaic way or the way the Essenes were doing it, it doesn't matter. It was still on the 14th. And I tend to think he was observing the Essene version of Passover, the one that didn't recognize animal sacrifices that were happening in the temple. And then how he could also that same day also be the Passover lamb who was crucified for the sins of the world. So whether the lamb was slain on the night that Jesus hosted the Last Supper with his disciples, or whether Jesus himself fulfilled the role of the lamb at the dinner, the fact remains that it was possible for Jesus to celebrate Passover on one day, and then on the same day actually be the Passover lamb. So I know I haven't answered all the questions that come up when we read about, all the things that happened during Passion Week in the first century. But most of the stuff that we, follow when it comes to, Good Friday and Easter and so on and so forth, really stems from paganism. It stems from the Roman Catholic Church and Constantine, and basically Satan trying to divorce Christianity from its Jewish roots, which are in Passover, first fruits, unleavened bread, Day of Atonement, and so on. That all of those feast days are prophetic of the plan of salvation and the plan of redemption. So this was something that I had been curious about for kind of a long time, is how could Jesus celebrate Passover and then die on Passover? And it seemed like they couldn't be at the same time. But if Jesus died on Wednesday, he could have celebrated the Essene Passover the night before, which always happened on a Tuesday. Or he could have also celebrated the way the Mosaic system said to do it, which was the 13th going into the 14th, having a whole day for Passover, and then starting the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the following day. The way the Sadducees did it anyway, they combined Passover with the first day of unleavened bread. In any case, this was called the Day of Preparation. And it was the preparation for this Sabbath right here. This was a high Sabbath. Okay, Passover was not technically a Sabbath day, but if you celebrated it on the same day as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is what the Sadducees did, then it would be a high Sabbath. So that is a solution. It's a solution to the conundrum of, was the Last Supper a Passover meal? So I hope this has been interesting for you. I know we're entering into this time of year when people celebrate Resurrection Day, and I've done a whole Bible study series on the Passover prophecies, how the Passover is prophetic, and there's so many layers to the Passover prophecy. And this is just more of a kind of an objective historical analysis of how this could have played out in the first century. So I also have a book that I've finished. It's called Convergence, and it's on Kindle right now, and it should be available as a paperback in a few days. And I've tried to make it available in more countries than the United States. So if you haven't been able to get it on Kindle and you live outside of the U.S., go ahead and check and see if you can't get it in your locale. I can't do worldwide, but we can do a few more places than just the United States. So if you do get my book and read it, if you could please leave a review in the Amazon store, because every review helps to get my book out there to more people. So thank you very much for doing that. So we'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.